Euthanasia is the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease or an irreversible coma. The practice is illegal in most countries, including the United States. Euthanasia comes in different forms such as assisted suicide, indirect euthanasia, voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, and finally there is active and passive euthanasia. The difference between these are that active is when you do something to make the person die, such as giving them an amount of painkillers to overdose and kill them that way, while passive euthanasia is when you do not give the person the medication necessary. Voluntary is the practice of the painless killing of a patient. Indirect euthanasia is allowing death to occur without direct link between the action, intent, and result. Both assisted suicide and euthanasia are illegal and could cause up to 14 years in prison for assisted suicide, and euthanasia could put you behind bars for life if severe enough. Even though this is illegal almost everywhere, physicians may, however, lawfully decide not to prolong life in cases of extreme suffering. Euthanasia should be legal everywhere because the doctors, families, and the patient should have the choice to end their own life prematurely if suffering from pain physically or psychologically. The right to die should be a personal choice to make for yourself, and if the patient can't make the decision on their own, then should be passed to a family member to make the decision. We have choices all throughout life, such as who to marry, what kind of work we want to do, and when it comes to your own life, I believe that you should have the choice of what you want to do when you reach that point. Because this is still illegal in most places, people that are terminally ill have to bear the agonizing, chronic, and unrelievable pain when they should have the choice to end their life early to bypass the symptoms. There are many different arguments about this touchy subject and whether or not people should have the choice to end their life early. This is because it is illegal for doctors to not do as much as they can to prevent death and to keep you alive for the longest time possible, which is unfair because some people are kept alive against their will and would like to be assisted in suicide or have the painless option of dying with help from a doctor. The slippery slope that people use against this argument is that they think that euthanasia will get in the hands of infants and young kids if they simply do not want to live anymore, which is not okay. And it will not be like that because the rules and regulations we will put on it. So this fear of the slippery slope of affecting younger teens and maybe even infants is out of the picture, which eliminates the problem of little kids getting a hold of it somehow or even doctors trying to give it to them. To avoid these problems, you must have regulations. And these regulations are you must have a terminal illness, you must be mentally competent, request this option twice, wait 2 weeks between requests, you must have a physical and mental assessment, and you must have 2 witnesses when you request euthanasia or assisted suicide. There are a few court cases on this topic that are very controversial, such as Washington versus Glucksberg. In January 1994, Dr. Harold Glucksberg and 3 other doctors, 3 terminally ill patients, and an organization called Compassion in Dying filed a suit in federal court for the declaration that Washington State's assisted suicide ban was unconstitutional as applied to terminally ill, mentally competent adults. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that Washington's assisted suicide ban was not unconstitutional. Another court case on this topic would be Vacco versus Quill. Dr. Timothy Quill, along with 2 other physicians and 3 terminally ill people, challenged the assisted suicide ban in New York State. They alleged it violated the due process, liberty, and equal protection guarantees of the 14th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court held that New York's prohibition on assisted suicide does not violate the equal protection rights of a terminally ill adult seeking physician assistance in committing suicide. The court rejected the notion in ending or refusing life-saving medical treatment is nothing more or less than assisted suicide. The assisted suicide was turned down and ruled unconstitutional in both of these court cases. They are very controversial because it was dealing with medication, physicians, and terminally ill patients that wanted assistance with their suicide. The court said the doctors giving out the prescriptions for the lethal medication and the person who takes it have the specific intent to cause death, where such as someone who just refuses treatment or stops taking the medication that they were prescribed might not have that same intent. The case of Terry Scavavo was an interesting case because in 1990, 26-year-old Terry Scavavo fell into a persistent vegetative state after suffering cardiac arrest. A fierce, highly public battle that took place between her parents, Robert and Mary, and her husband, Michael Scavavo, who wanted to disconnect her feeding tube. Terry's husband argued that his wife would not have wanted her life to be artificially prolonged, with no hope of recovery. This case created an emotional trial that ended with the court siding with Michael, but the state legislature passed a bill known as Terry's Law, giving Florida Governor Jeb Bush authority to prevent the removal of the feeding tube. After a lot of back and forth between the family and legal officials, the feeding tube was removed and ending the long legal struggle over her faith. And when she died on March 31st, 2005, nearly 15 years after the incident happened. The long struggle could have been defeated in the much earlier years if the Terry Law wasn't established. This happened in Pinellas Park, Florida. Court officials say that euthanasia and assisted suicide is wrong because of the assistance part of it, and if a doctor or a physician helps with the death of another person, that they can be held liable for the death and be prosecuted with a homicide. A physician who's not named evaded criminal prosecution time and time again because he merely provided the tools for another person to commit their own suicide. While he provided the equipment to allow terminally ill patients to end their own lives, in most cases that's all he did. He would not operate the equipment, which is why he did not commit the homicide any more than a car manufacturer commits a homicide if a drunk driver kills somebody in a traffic accident. The best benefit of legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide would be the relief of excruciating and unremitting pain of 25,000 or more Americans each year. In some cases, life-supporting machines are turned off and patients die. Sometimes it is decided not to give the patients food anymore. In other cases, antibiotics, chemotherapy, or giving a person morphine may lead to their death. The main problem is who decides if and when euthanasia should be carried out. Sometimes the relatives of an incurably ill patient make the decision based on what they think the patient wants. In other cases, the patient may have written down a will that states they want the machines to be turned off if there is no hope. And this is what causes the problems and arguments about when a person should be killed or not. This is also where people argue about whether or not this is constitutional. Some reasons people might choose to be assisted with suicide are because everyone has the right to decide when their life should end. If the quality of life has become so bad, a person might feel too much physical or emotional pain. Today's hospitals are overcrowded and have too many patients. Some argue that they should let those die who do not have a chance of living on. In that way, there could be more room for patients with diseases that could be cured, which is a valid argument for people who want this to happen, but people feel like this is wrong and that everyone should live for as long as possible. But if the first relatives or the patient, him or herself, says it shouldn't be a problem to end one's life. If I were in charge, I would make euthanasia or assisted suicide legal in all 50 states because I believe that all people should have the right to choose whether or not they want to continue living or not. I say this because people simply do not want to lay in a hospital bed until the day they finally die. If there is no cure or hope that a patient will continue to live or get better, then I think they should be able to make the choice that they want. Considering your own death might seem like a cruel and unusual exercise. However, for many people each year who face terminal diagnosis and debilitating chronic illnesses, these exact thoughts might cross their minds. They certainly should have this right. As many with chronic illnesses face unbearable pain and suffering, shouldn't people have the right to choose when they die on their own terms? Today, in 6 states, including California, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington, and the District of Columbia, have adopted Death with Dignity Acts. The law allows terminally ill individuals to choose when and how they die. The state of Montana doesn't have legislation around the death with dignity. However, end-of-life options are legal in the state due to a Supreme Court ruling. There are 26 other states considering legalizing assisted suicide in 2019. The United States spent $3.5 trillion in 2017 on health care. This equates to nearly $11,000 per person each year. With the cost of health care increasing, the opponents of the right to die worry that the health insurance, physicians, and even the government could start to look at those with terminal illness as a burden to society, and that could be stopped sooner. They worry that the right to die could easily become an expectation to die for the greater good if that decision became the norm. Many are still divided on this issue, and the debate is far from over. Even with the opposition in mind, it just seems unjust that we allow ill people to go with suffering without considering what they want and how they want to go. We should allow people to decide for themselves how and when they want to die. If someone knows they're dying, they should be able to make this incredibly important decision on their own, without someone telling them when and how they can end their life. If we can allow animals to be put down at our choosing, we should certainly allow humans to choose when and how they want to die. If you had a family member who is suffering from a terrible illness, wouldn't you want to let them decide what's best for them and give them the right to die on their own terms? Many families are seeing loved ones in horrible pain every day. It's time we give those suffering an opportunity to choose their own fate and decide when and how they should leave this world.